Welcome back, everybody. I hope that you liked the movie that you had to watch for class, The Battle of Algiers. I know it was particularly difficult to watch in certain places, but I thought it was important to see for a couple of reasons. One, it's been considered one of the best movies ever made about terrorism, and I thought that it would be good for y'all to see that, good for you to see what's considered such a monumentally important movie, as well as the fact that I think it does a pretty good job at covering a lot of the subjects that we've covered in this class, looking at different governments and how they respond to terrorism, looking at secessionist movements and terrorism, looking at governments' counterterrorism strategies, looking at the way terrorist groups try to craft their campaigns in a particular way. And so, for all these reasons, I thought it was a really good movie for us to show here as we finish up and get close to ending the class. I'm going to give a brief recap of the movie, give a little background and set up, refresher of the plot and what happened before we jump into discussing particular elements of it. So, as you saw, the Battle of Algiers is about the time period from the movie goes from 1954 until 1960, looking at the uprisings in the city of Algiers, the capital of Algeria, which is under French colonialism, French control, and had been since about 1830. The French had controlled Algeria. And even before World War II in the 1930s, there had been starting to push for independence of Algeria, certain movements, but really after World War II and into the early 1950s, there's a big movement, especially in the countryside of Algeria, of the FLN, the National Liberation Front, working to try to gain Algerian independence. And then the Battle of Algiers is what we see in the movie, particularly focused on the accounts and everything that happens in Algeria, starting around 1954, when the conflict really moves to the cities and from the countryside. And so some interesting elements of the Battle of Algiers and this conflict of Algerian, that really we see a push for Algerian independence and liberation from France, is the fact that unlike most other colonies around the world, especially for France, there are about 1 million French citizens who live in Algeria by the early 1950s. And they were often given the name Pied Noir. They called Blackfeet because these individuals who lived there largely were born there, grew up in Algeria. And at the time, Algeria was even considered part of France. It had, unlike other colonies that were administrated and had different types of administration, Algeria was actually considered a province of France. And the French, the million or so French who lived there, actually would vote, send individuals to the French national parliament. Although these rights were only really reserved for French, very few Algerians had the capacity to actually vote. They really lived in a segregated, apartheid style society in Algeria. And so the movie really looks at the escalating struggle between the FLN and the French colonizers, looking at the tit for tat, the escalation of violence as the French try to repress the FLN. The FLN responds by carrying out attacks. And we just see this increasing level of violence throughout the movie, really ultimately culminating, as you saw in the epilogue, of the continued uprising of the Algerians in 1960, which the Algerians ultimately get their independence from France in 1962. So the Battle of Algiers, really, based on the movie, we can see once ultimately the 4 leaders of the FLN are killed or brought into custody, really in a lot of ways, quote unquote, ends the Battle of Algiers. The French win the Battle of Algiers, but ultimately they lose the war in Algeria, with Algeria ultimately gaining its independence. So let's try to think about the goal. I also want to think about the goal and the ramifications of the movie. So the movie was made by an Italian filmmaker, Gillo Pontecorvo, and he directed the movie, was, I believe, a co-screenwriter of the movie. It was made in 1966. So what's really interesting also to think about this movie is how prescient it is. It's only 4 years after Algeria has actually gained its independence. And because of this had a lot of political ramifications for when it was made. And actually, the French government prevented the movie from being shown in France for 5 years after it was made. So the movie wasn't actually seen in France in movie theaters until I believe around 1970, 1971, because the French government did not want the movie to be showed, especially because of, as we saw in the movie, the actions that the French government was willing to take to try and suppress the uprising and to try to repress the FLN and the Algerian people. And the filmmaker Gillo Pontecorvo, what he said was his goal was really try to make an objective account. And I think we can see this as interesting in the portrayal of the various characters, how the movie moves back and forth, looking at the Algerian perspective, the French perspective, and trying to put those side by side to allow the viewer to make their determination of how they perceive the ultimate event. And so this is, I think, an interesting way that he tried to set it up. And in a lot of ways, it has a feel in a lot of ways of almost like a newsreel, almost like a projection of what actually happened. And as he says, and he emphasized when he made the movie, is he uses no newsreel footage, but he tried to adopt a extremist realist perspective on trying to show what actually happened in this period of time in the uprisings in Algiers. And the movie's had a real long-lasting effect and really has lingered in popular conscious, as well as has actually become a tool that is not just something that film directors, people in the arts look at. Governments have actually tried to look at the movie and study it and learn from it. And there was a lot made from the fact that the U.S. government in 2003, before they invaded Iraq, had a showing of the Battle of Algiers among a lot of top military officials at the Pentagon, really seen as trying to think about what were some of the issues that the French ran into in their attempt to try to put down uprisings in Algiers, and thinking about how the U.S. government was considering this in their potential invasion of Iraq and how perhaps things might play out in Baghdad. So this continues to have an important cultural and political ramifications today. So this film is really still quite prescient. So I really wanted to then spend most of the time today talking about, in a lot of ways, the two types of terrorism that I think that we've talked about in the class and that appear in the movie. And the first I think we need to focus on is the idea of state terrorism. While much of what we've talked about in the class has not been state terrorism, we devoted one class to it. I think it's important to first emphasize the repressive tactics used by the French state and the French state's willingness to go to extreme lengths to try to repress the FLN. And we also think about this. I think it's important to start here because we can think about the resources that the French government has. And it's estimated that in the conflict over the whole period of conflict in the 1950s, in the early 1960s, of Algerians fighting for independence, that is estimated that the French may have killed up to 1 million Algerians. The official French estimates are 350,000, but again, we have to be concerned about potential skewing of these figures based on some attempt for the French government to try to portray itself in a more positive light. But regardless, 350,000 is not an insignificant number by any stretch of the imagination, right? This is extreme cost of life because the French are unwilling to give up Algeria. And a lot of the reason this is the case is, as I said, over 1 million French citizens live there. The French do not want to leave Algeria, whereas they're more willing to give up other colonial possessions where they don't have the same extent of French citizens living there. This isn't the case with Algeria. So the French are very unwilling and willing to engage in extreme tactics to not give up their hold of Algeria. And we see in the movie, they're willing to resort to certain extreme tactics. So we see that they're willing to bomb the house of the individuals they suspect to be terrorists. So this is early in the movie. They go into the Kasbah. The old part of the city was primarily where ethnic Algerians, the Arabic population, lived, and they detonate a bomb indiscriminately killing who they, a suspected terrorist family. And this really serves to set off a lot of the escalating violence. And really what they were trying to do is essentially to terrorize the Algerian population into submission. But we see this really in a lot of ways ultimately backfires, and we have this escalation of violence, which leads to the killing of French police officers, who were seen as sort of the most visible representation of Algerian repression. The police officers who would walk the streets, harass Algerian citizens, Arabic Algerian citizens, and these were the individuals that they began to target and then escalate into more bombings and more attacks. And so the French even respond. As we can see, they don't take a diplomatic response to this. They don't try to negotiate with the Arabic Algerians. They don't try to, in a lot of ways, find a political solution. Their determination is they try to adopt a militaristic counterterrorism strategy. And this is where they deploy the paratroopers to occupy the city, led by Colonel Mathieu, who actually is supposed to be a representation of an actual historical French colonel named, I believe, Rapon, who led the paratroopers in Algeria during the Battle of Algiers. So this character Mathieu is supposed to be based on an actual individual. And what he ends up doing, as we see, is he says that their strategy needs to become a focus on eliminating the top officials of the FLN to try and cut off that, what he says, as he says, cut off the head of the tapeworm. And this is, again, we talked about that in some ways militaristic strategies can be effective for targeting leaders of terrorist organizations. But there's a real question as well about how effective that can ultimately be. And we see in the process of trying to target and take out the heads of the FLN, they're willing to engage in extreme tactics. They segregate the city. They set up checkpoints. They torture Algerian Arabs to try to gain information. They're willing to execute people in the process of trying to get to the heads of the FLN. So they engage in extremist tactics, these methods of state terrorism to try to ultimately repress this uprising. But as we see, Algeria ends up in the epilogue. You see the uprisings aren't squashed, and Algeria ultimately gains its independence in 1962. So what I want to get at here is the first discussion question, and that's discussion question 1. And that is, why do you think the French strategy of killing the 4 leaders of the FLN didn't ultimately stop the uprisings as Colonel Mathieu expected? Again, discussion question 1. Why do you think the French strategy of killing the 4 leaders of the FLN didn't ultimately stop the uprisings as Colonel Mathieu expected? So the other element here that we have to look at as well is the elements of non-state terrorism, right? We see the FLN is willing to carry out extensive attacks on the French, and we can see they're willing to kill police officers, which, again, this gets back to our definition of terrorism, right? Who do the targets have to be? In some instances, perhaps if we think about police officers and they're considered hard targets, they're not civilians, then perhaps this action is seen more in guerrilla warfare terms. But again, this depends ultimately on our interpretation of what constitutes terrorism and what doesn't. And so this again, and I think the film really gets at this idea, is the difficulty of trying to assess what constitutes terrorism and what doesn't. And this idea as well, we get with these actions of these non-state terrorists, are they terrorists again, or are they freedom fighters? And I mean, we have to ask the question. So when the FLN carries out numerous bombings, we see the women of the Algerian Arabic women who disguise themselves in a lot of way by adopting more French dress appearance. They're able to slip through the checkpoints to carry out bombings of soft targets to kill innocent people in cafes, bars, at the Air France terminal. And this process continues. They only show these particular bombings of these civilian targets, but in the movie, but they continue to carry out these attacks as well throughout that period after 1954 up until independence. So, really asking the question about are the actions that they're taking justified in their pursuit of independence, to fight back against the colonial rulers who are also carrying out extremely repressive tactics. And so, to leave it there, not go on too long with this particular lecture, I'll leave this with the final discussion question 2. And that is, are anyone's actions justified in this movie? Again, discussion question 2, to try to, I think, summarize and think about ultimately how we're supposed to think about the movie as a whole. Discussion question 2, are anyone's actions justified in this movie? All right, thanks everybody, and I will talk to you again soon.